Western media under control, when the empire speaks in the name of freedom. The illusion of independence. Western journalism is traditionally seen as a bastion of free speech, a counterweight to authoritarianism, and a source of impartial reporting on global events. However, a closer look at this media landscape reveals that things are far from transparent. Many media outlets, especially those targeting Russian-speaking audiences, receive funding from Western governments and foundations. Their mission seems clear: to counter Kremlin propaganda and convey the truth about war, repression, and corruption. But here lies the paradox. The leadership of these structures is almost universally composed of Russian journalists. This is no coincidence, nor is it a result of a shortage of qualified personnel. It is a systemic choice. It's important to understand that individuals from Russia, even those who have left the country, often carry an implicit drive to preserve the imperial paradigm. These people may be vocal critics of Putin, they may sincerely oppose repression and war, but their rhetoric almost always lacks one crucial element: the recognition of Russia's multinational nature and the rights of oppressed peoples to self-determination. Who do the Russian media in the West represent? Take, for example, the channel Current Time. It is headed by Pavel Bugorkin, a journalist who spent many years working in Russian state and semi-state media. Under his leadership, the media outlet shows a clear focus on the Russian narrative, where the subject of subjugated peoples is taboo. On Current Time, representatives of Russia's indigenous and colonized peoples, Buryats, Ingush, Chechens, Tuvans, Oirat-Kalmyks, Tatars, Sakha-Yakuts, Udmurts, and others rarely appear. Their stories, their pain, their struggle for the right to be heard remain outside public attention. Instead, a homogeneous picture is created, one of good Russians and bad Russians, where all other peoples seem not to exist at all. This portrayal, wittingly or unwittingly, reproduces the same model these media supposedly oppose: a centralized state where power and voice belong solely to Russians. The only difference is that now it is liberal Russians instead of imperial security officials. But the essence remains unchanged. The empire continues to speak on behalf of all peoples colonized by Russians. Silence as a form of suppression. This approach is not limited to Current Time alone. A similar pattern is observed in the editorial offices of Novaya Gazeta, Europe, TV Rain, Dozd, and other outlets funded by Western institutions. Formally, these are alternative opposition platforms. In reality, they are the same Russian-led editorial boards that talk extensively about war, corruption, and abuse of power, but say almost nothing about the rights of the peoples Russia has suppressed for centuries and continues to suppress today. Silence is also a form of suppression. When a Buryat soldier dies in the trenches near Avdiivka, but is referred to in the broadcast simply as a Russian soldier, it erases his identity. When a Chechen activist speaks about repression in the Republic, but his story is framed as part of Russia's opposition struggle, it devalues his cause. And this is the result of deliberate editorial policy. Even Ukrainian TV channels, which one would expect to be interested in dismantling the imperial discourse, increasingly invite the same Russian experts and political analysts. Despite their anti-Putin rhetoric, these experts consistently avoid addressing the colonial nature of modern Russia, as if the war were solely Putin's problem rather than the product of a broader historical system. Consequences and lost opportunities. This situation has profound consequences. Amid the bloody war in Ukraine, ruined cities, and hundreds of thousands of deaths, the Western information sphere remains captive to the Russian world, albeit in a liberal wrapper. Paradoxically, the West has effectively withdrawn from promoting a genuinely anti-imperial agenda. As a result, the oppressed peoples have no real levers of influence over public opinion in Europe and the United States. Their voices remain marginalized, their struggles invisible, their histories untold. Lack of access to major media platforms blocks any effort to influence the agendas of Western politicians who still operate in terms of a democratic Russia, a future without Putin, and the Russian opposition. When President Donald Trump froze funding for USAID and the U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM, in March 2025, it caused a real crisis. Hundreds of projects launched with Western grants were left without funds. Among them was an entire layer of Russian journalists in the West, deeply dependent on these resources. And at that moment, Their astounding opportunism became evident. Instead of resisting publicly, they began suing and begging the foundations to preserve funding in the name of the Russian diaspora's voice. Specific examples. Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty, RFE-RRL, a US AGM-funded media outlet broadcasting in Russian. After Trump ordered a full halt to grants, they filed a lawsuit against the administration, claiming the decision violated Congress's authority as the sole body authorized to allocate funds. Meanwhile, journalists, many of whom have refugee status and work from Prague, Riga, and Vilnius, suddenly lost their contracts, threatening their legal ability to remain in Europe. Meduza, one of the most well-known independent Russian-language portals based in Latvia. According to an investigation by the New York Times, up to 15% of its annual income came through USAID, though these grants were not publicly disclosed. Losing this funding could halt its publishing activity altogether. Mediazona, an outlet associated with Pussy Riot and actively supporting the late Alexei Navalny, who died in February 2024. As the Grey Zone discovered, hasty appeals for help were made to the British government and foundations immediately after the grant freeze, further demonstrating that the project was built from the start for external sponsorship and Western support. Numerous diaspora initiatives, associations, and NGOs, including projects aiding displaced Russians, human rights activists, and media startups. More than 90 organizations ceased operations after the USAID funding freeze, including the ARC Day, which provided housing, legal aid, and psychological support, instantly losing half its budget. They're not fighting, they're flailing. Instead of openly acknowledging their transitory nature and diversifying sources of support, they rush to protest and protect their monopolization of the Western stage, desperate to preserve power through financial control. They changed their names, not their structures. New projects were renamed and rebranded, often placed under legitimate banners, but the rivers of internal control, opacity, and ideological gatekeeping continued to flow. Marginal, inconvenient, or critical voices that challenged the dominant narrative were excluded. The paradox. Those who flee Putin's regime become its outposts in the West, not media intermediaries between cultures, but icons of the grant service industry, siphoning resources while preserving the face of the Russian Empire, not the truth. They are not democratic but isolated, unwilling to be transparent, afraid to admit foreign funding to Russian audiences, yet when grants are frozen, they run back to the same donors who originally funded them. At the moment when a formal crisis, sudden cuts in funding, reveals the true nature of these media structures, it becomes clear they are not bridges but bastions of influence. The grant cuts expose their total lack of alternatives and complete dependence on their handlers. This is not classical emigration journalism. It is a migration of style and rhetoric into a grant-funded archipelago, where freedom of speech is just a slogan, and security depends not on principle, but on foundation budgets. Western journalists, editors, and funders continue to pour resources into projects that reproduce the same system of centralization and silencing that has harmed millions. The empire remains. Only its face changes. We, the representatives of the peoples oppressed and colonized by Russians, remain out of the game. Our voice has not triggered change, and as long as the Western media space is dominated by those who view Russia exclusively as a Russian state, that is unlikely to change.